Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of May 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, Ph.D. economist. Today, we'll look at the investigation of former FBI Director James Comey. We'll hear about a Pennsylvania Supreme Court case on carbon fees. We'll discuss trade relations between China and the U.S. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Post that has brought James Comey under scrutiny, it's Dan McCaleb.
In a shocking development late Thursday, the Secret Service and the Department of Homeland Security say they are investigating a social media post from former FBI Director James Comey that many consider a veiled threat on President Donald Trump's life. On Instagram, Comey posted a picture of seashells in the sand with the numbers 86 and 47. 86 is often used to refer to eliminating something or someone. Donald Trump is the 47th president of the United States. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, it's interesting. To me, 86 is back in the waiting tables days when you ran out of a certain ingredient. You have to 86 it from the menu. Of course, there's some kind of ambiguity on what 86 means. Could it just mean impeach Trump? Could it mean, neutralize him politically somehow? Comey received a lot of blowback, and a lot of people said this was a call for violence. There's a lot in the Trump camp and on the Trump side who have a very low tolerance for this kind of thing from the left because they feel falsely accused of inciting violence because of January 6th. They feel like the President Trump was falsely accused of inciting a riot when they think he didn't really do that. They think all the January 6th people basically were led into the Capitol by Capitol Police and then accused of like some kind of great act of grave violence. And so anytime the left or anyone perceived as a Democrat or the left does anything, they're very quick to jump on it because they feel like a very harsh standard was applied to them on January 6th. And so I think that's what you're seeing here. Comey, of course, is really, I think, actually kind of hated by the left and the right. A lot on the right dislike him because of his role and kind of the debunked investigations into President Trump. But a lot of Democrats don't like him either because they feel like he handed the election to Trump. You remember James Comey in 2016 went out there and did a press conference right before Election Day and kind of suggested that maybe Hillary Clinton did do something wrong or there was more to this investigation and a really bad time for her. And I think a lot in people in the Hillary Clinton camp blame Comey. So Comey doesn't have a lot of friends left. He made this post, probably a bad, a lack of judgment for someone in his position. He took a lot of blowback, and then he posted on a follow-up post, and he said that basically he didn't think of it as violent. He took the post down, and he said, I saw it as just like a political message that I stumbled upon, and I would never call for violence. So that's kind of where it landed. But I think, I was trying to give some explanation for why people were so quick and so you may be unforgiving for Comey's lapse in judgment.
and in these highly charged times of political rhetoric where Republicans have accused Democrats, you remember you had Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker referencing Nazis like 6 times in his State of the State address earlier this year in reference to Trump. President Trump, when he was on the campaign trail last year in Butler, Pennsylvania, a sniper got on a roof, an attempted assassin, fired off several shots, including grazing then former President Trump's ear and killing someone who was in attendance in the audience. And then you had the incident at the golf course where another would-be assassin lined up on the golf course near where Trump was playing. Thankfully was thwarted by the Secret Service then. And now you've got a former FBI director posting something, even if that's not what he intended. You would just think you'd be more careful with your rhetoric in these highly charged times.
Right. Yeah, of course. A big louse in judgment. And I think I'm glad you brought up the Nazi thing, because if you scour kind of the dark underbelly of Twitter and different places in the internet where political discourse is happening the way I do, the reason the Nazi comparison is so relevant to this conversation about violence is because before Trump, there's sort of this ongoing philosophical and moral question and debate of, would violence against Nazis be okay? Basically, you've even heard the joke. It's sort of a joke, but not always a joke about if you could kill baby Hitler, would you do it? Right. And that was kind of like a philosophical question. Would it be right to kill baby Hitler? He's a baby, he's innocent, so it's wrong, but also you could save the lives of millions of people. He did it right. And that's kind of like a common online, philosophical debate. And it's relevant because then it's kind of grown into this idea of like punching Nazis is okay. You see a lot of rhetoric along that. And the point I'm making is that the Nazi issue is important because if you can actually say that one party or one group of people are truly Nazis, then you can, in the minds of many people, you can justify violence against them because you make a comparison to World War II, and a lot of people say that they would have fought the Nazis, or it would have been okay to assassinate Hitler or different things. And so if you can equate Trump or, the way they tried to say that Musk was doing a Nazi salute, that's why that battle is so intense, because the Nazi comparisons are tied to the violence, in a unique way. And so, I think that's why you're seeing such reaction from Republicans. I think the Nazi comparisons are often very lazy. To me, it reveals that people don't know any other time period in history than the World War II movies they watched. There's a lot of political movements in history. There's a lot of villains of history. There's a lot of dictators of history. And if all people can come up with is the Nazis and Hitler, I think it's a sign of kind of a historical ignorance. There's a lot of things about the modern Republican Party and Trump that are just completely opposite. But that's why the Nazi thing is important. Does it justify violence? I'm hopeful that we can tone down the rhetoric and also just move to a point where we feel like calls for violence are so ridiculous and uncalled for that they're immediately shut down the way that this Comey one was.
Yeah, so Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem responded late Thursday saying the Secret Service was going to investigate. They are taking it seriously. Current FBI Director Patel also said the FBI was ready to assist in any investigations. So it looks like they're going to be questioning Comey at a minimum over the post. Just to close out, I do want to read Comey's complete statement after he took the post down. Looking for that now. Here it is. I posted earlier a picture of some shells I saw today on a beach walk, which I assumed were a political message. I didn't realize some folks associate those numbers with violence. It never occurred to me, but I oppose violence of any kind, so I took the post down. Final words, Casey.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I think we can agree we don't want the violence. The reason you're seeing such animus in the Trump camp also, besides what we've already discussed, is there's this feeling and this hope that Trump is going to put a lot of these high-ranking officials who they see as corrupt in jail. And so that's why you're seeing this kind of like more rabid calls for investigation. There's a lot of people who still want to lock up Hillary, lock up Comey, lock up a lot of these top-ranking Democrat officials who they see as very corrupt, lock up Pelosi for allegedly insider trading, all this stuff. And so far, Trump hasn't done that. So anytime one of these guys steps out of line, it reignites that fervor. that call for justice and to root out the corruption that Trump, spoke so much of on the campaign trail. I don't think this is going to get to that point. I think that the Trump administration and Trump's allies are sending a message to Comey that we do have the power. We have the power to investigate you and force you to come in. So get back in line and cut this stuff out.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the regional carbon tax case in Pennsylvania, it's Eliana Kernodle.
Today, we're talking about a case before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, can you tell us about this case?
Sure. This is a case that's been going on for years at this point, although it could be decades for us reporters who are covering it. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is one that is meant to reduce pollution across 11 different states. And Pennsylvania is not one of those states yet, although the Department of Environmental Protection under Governor Josh Shapiro and formerly Tom Wolf want us to be. Crucially, the legislature does not want us to be. And the main debate here is that if you enter us into the program, what is going to happen is that polluters, which in their case is energy generators, electricity generators, they will have to essentially pay for the emissions that come from their production. And by doing that, they're supposed to slowly ratchet down what they're emitting into the atmosphere by investing in technology that would help them do that. The reason this program exists is because states are trying to usher in the renewable energy transition, but that is very difficult when we rely so much on fossil fuels. And this is considered a way to help do that. The idea with this program is that by 2040, the participating states, their power generators would be down to zero carbon emissions, which sounds like a really heavy lift. And it is, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania, where we are a huge power exporter and we have a ton of natural gas production. So if we were to enter this program, it is very likely that electricity prices would rise, and that would be terrible. I mean, rise by double digits, 30% in some estimates. And that would be really difficult for consumers to absorb, especially during economic uncertainty. So what's before this case is the question of, does the state have the authority to override what could be a potential tax or is this more like a fee that they are levying that is important because keeping the air clean is more important or is worth risking a rise in utility bills? So that's kind of the central argument. Is it a tax or is it a fee?
And why is the distinction between tax and fee so legally important?
So if it's a fee, then that means that the state has the power to enact it through regulation, because part of the state's argument is that it's a fee, we're collecting it for a very specific purpose, and then we're going to use that money to reinvest back into this program and into our goals of renewable energy transition. But if it's a tax, that is unconstitutional for the state to enact without getting legislative approval first. And legislative approval is going to be essentially impossible given that our General Assembly is split. Senate Republicans are very much opposed to RGGI. House Democrats are supportive of it. And Governor Josh Shapiro, while he doesn't love the concept of a multi-state program, he has his eyes set on a state-based program that would do a lot of the same thing. So as you can see, Republicans have no interest in getting this particular program or even really his state-based one to his desk. It's worth it to them to wait to see how the Supreme Court rules on this issue.
And this week, as they were discussing this, talking to state officials in court, whatnot, what were kind of some of the big points of conversation?
Well, the big point for the state is that not only is this a fee and not a tax, but that they have the authority under the Federal Clean Air Act to do this. Because, as I mentioned before, keeping air clean for residents is above importance of all things. They have the right to clean air. But justices were very skeptical of this. They had a lot of questions because that's a very broad interpretation. And if they can limit emissions from the power sector right now, what's to stop them from going after vehicles and even cows and anything else that emits harmful gas? And so there's not really, the state didn't have a very strong response. It's almost a rhetorical question in that sense. But the attorneys that represent power generators, their argument, and the Senate for that matter, their argument is this is unconstitutional. This is going to impact jobs. This is a policy decision. And so therefore, this should have been decided on by elected representatives. Now, judges did have questions about, in general, if it's a tax or a fee for their perspective. But there was also a lot of conversation about, is entering into this program, does it count as an interstate compact? And this is a little bit convoluted, but it's important to the overall discussion. Are we creating a market for limiting emissions? And therefore, the state is entering us into this market without legislative input? Or is it more just an agreement, like a collaboration between states to the end of a goal? The state says it's a collaboration, but judges don't seem to be so sure. And that it could be, one of the justices said, from his perspective, it's akin to talking about selling liquor across state lines. It doesn't make sense. We have a very tight state-run system. So for alcohol. So there's a lot of confusion and concern because we've never been in anything like this program. We don't know what the implications are. And the Supreme Court, it weighs heavily on them because the precedent that it sets really sets the stage for future regulatory authority by the state and for the future of climate policy in Pennsylvania.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. You can follow this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Eliana and Kristen. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on trade with China, let's go back to Dan McCaleb.
After significant trade negotiations last weekend, the U.S. and China agreed this week to pause their tariff war, lowering tariffs across the board as the world's two largest economies look to reshape international trade. Stocks soared on the news. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, how significant could a permanent trade deal between the U.S. and China be?
Well, it's hard to overstate how significant it could be. I mean, I think the fate of the U.S., certainly the fate of the Chinese economy is in play, and even the U.S. economy is heavily impacted by this. We, import an incredible amount of cheap goods from China and sell them in the U.S. There's a lot of businesses in the U.S., small businesses included, that rely entirely on imports from China and have already gone out of business or on the verge of going out of business because of tariffs. So there's a lot of very happy business people in light of this pause and this agreement. I think it's good for both China and the U.S. It's hopefully going to be a more targeted approach that hits on specific industries that we're looking on redeveloping instead of blanket tariffs over the whole globe. I mean, first off, it was, entire countries and whole parts of the world getting tariffed, and China included. And now we're paring that back, and we can maybe do specific tariffs on certain industries. And so if Trump is really interested in rebuilding, manufacturing base in the U.S., that's great. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there's a real national security concern there. If we don't have the manufacturing capacity as a nation to, build enough vehicles and planes and bombs and guns and make enough of our own food and antibiotics and, other prescription drugs, then I think that's a real national security issue. If all of a sudden we're going to war with China over Taiwan and it turns out they make everything for us, we're going to be in trouble, right? We're going to have an issue. So there's a real national security problem there. It makes sense to do this, but some of these tariffs were so broad that they were tariffing things that we don't even want to make in the U.S. or have the capacity to make in the U.S. Or maybe we don't even have the right minerals or resources to make this in the U.S. So I'm hopeful that this new deal can get it more narrowly targeted. Like we're going to go after auto industry. We're going to go after, manufacturing of these certain goods and microchips and these things that are really important instead of a blanket tariff that causes a lot of unnecessary economic pain.
So on Liberation Day, as he called it, President Trump instituted a wide swath of tariffs on not just on China, on European nations, Asian nations, etc. A week later, after markets reacted negatively to that, he lifted all of the tariffs, or he reduced all of the tariffs down to a 10% baseline, except on China, which he kept at 45%. China and the U.S. are by far the world's two largest economies. So that had the potential to really negatively affect international trade across the world. But after last weekend's negotiations, they both brought their tariffs on each other down as they continue to talk on a much larger trade deal. This could have seriously significant global implications in resetting trade across all countries. And that could be significant for everybody's economy, including the U.S.'s.
Yeah, I think so. And it's good that we're being proactive, because global trade has been resetting for years now without us, in a sense. I mean, we've had different countries doing things and developing. We've had, for instance, BRICS. So we have these nations like, Brazil and India and others getting together, working on issues like oil and currency. And we have China investing in countries all over the world, Africa and other countries, investing in infrastructure, buying ports from other people. I mean, China has been very aggressively trying to, via kind of predatory investment and buying ports and everything, taking over, a lot of these countries in the trade realm. And so there's been like a very slow realignment that's been happening year after year. And the U.S. has just sort of been watching it happen. And it's like we're waiting for the inevitable, which is the top superpower to fall, because we think that's what happens in history. The empire always replaced by another. But the president is doing something proactive to realign that. Now he may inadvertently hasten the economic downfall of the U.S. And by downfall, I don't mean collapse. I just mean us kind of moving to where there's a multipolar world, which is to say, instead of the U.S. being the one and only dominant economic force, we might have, 2 or 3 dominant economic forces that balance across the globe. I don't know. But there's some kind of systemic issues in the U.S. economy that Trump is trying to address. We can't just rely on inflated tech company valuations to say our economy's good. Just because some app is valued at, $50 billion doesn't mean it actually has like real, economic value, long term. It's not actually producing anything. It's not tied to any natural resources. It's not really employing that many people. And so you have to think about kind of like what's under the hood of the economy, and do we have the manufacturing capacity? Are we, investing in oil and gas, drilling? Biden really discouraged that. And we're actually seeing lawsuits pop up all over the U.S. right now to discourage, domestic oil and gas production. So that, there's things like that, that are, I think, indicators of more like the long-term health of the economy that have been troubling. And so getting under the hood the way Trump is and trying to realign things and keep up with the changes that are happening globally, it makes a lot of sense. Now, the devil's in the details and whether he can execute that well. Some people are doubtful for it, but he's trying, and I guess we'll see how successful he is in this.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks again, Dan and Casey. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How will the budget in Congress impact taxes and Medicare? What did a California judge rule on parental notification for elementary school gender lessons? And does rent control help housing affordability? We'll have all that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. A federal grand jury indicted a Wisconsin judge Tuesday on charges she helped shield a person illegally in the country from federal immigration officials at the Milwaukee County Courthouse. Federal prosecutors charged Judge Hannah Dugan with obstruction of a federal proceeding and concealing an individual to prevent discovery or arrest. The obstruction charge could result in up to a $100,000 fine and a year in prison, while the second concealment charge can result in up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. Dugan's defense team released a statement saying the judge maintains her innocence and looks forward to proving it in court. Parents of Eden Alexander, a 21-year-old from New Jersey and the last remaining American hostage held by Hamas, said Tuesday they always believed the day would come that they would see their son. Yael and Adi Alexander, his mother and father, were reunited Monday at Re'im military base in Israel. A day later at a Tel Aviv hospital, they said, quote, hope is mandatory, end quote, in such situations. Alexander was among 251 taken hostage, then just a 19-year-old member of the Israeli Defense Forces. 4 other Americans are believed dead and their bodies still being held by Hamas. President Donald Trump signed an executive order Monday aiming to slash U.S. prescription drug prices by ensuring America doesn't pay more than its economic peer countries for pharmaceutical drugs. To lower what the U.S. pays for drugs and achieve price parity with other countries, the order directs administration officials like Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to develop pricing targets for drug manufacturers and to create direct-to-consumer purchasing programs for pharmaceutical companies that comply with those targets. If drug companies don't conform to the new standards, the order authorizes federal rulemaking to impose most favored nation pricing and encourages potentially importing more prescription drugs, as well as the Food and Drug Administration potentially revoking drug approvals. A bipartisan group of New York City councilors are asking the Trump administration to take the city to court over its sanctuary laws, alleging the restrictions are shielding criminal aliens from apprehension and putting the public at risk. In a letter to Attorney General Pam Bondi, 7 members of the council's Common Sense Caucus asked the Justice Department to file legal action against the city over its policies that restrict cooperation by the New York police and other law enforcement with federal immigration crackdowns. Microsoft has announced plans to lay off thousands of employees across the company. The 3% workforce reduction was confirmed by a Microsoft spokesperson in a Tuesday email to the Center Square. The Redmond, Washington-based tech giant did not give a specific number of employees who will be cut. But as of March 31st, the company reported having 126,000 workers in the United States and 102,000 international employees for a total of 228,000 employees worldwide. That would mean about 6,800 Microsoft employees could be losing their jobs in these newly announced cuts. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the budget markup, it's Casey Harper.
President Donald Trump has called for one big, beautiful bill to come out of Congress with all of his legislative priorities. That's tax cuts, that's some spending cuts and some spending increases. There's a lot going on there. It's rapidly changing day to day. And someone who's been covering it very closely and very well is Therese Boudreau. Therese is here to explain it all. Thanks, Therese.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Casey.
Now, I don't want to oversell it. Explaining it all is pretty difficult because if you're trying to keep up with this legislation right now, the numbers, the estimates are changing constantly. They're doing these, over 24-hour markups of the legislation. But let's just take some of the big blocks that are happening right now. What kind of tax cuts or changes to the tax law are we seeing starting to form in this, big legislative agenda for Republicans?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of tax cuts and a lot of tax promises that Trump made on the campaign trail that if this bill passes, the giant bill where all of the stuff is put together, it will permanently extend the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that means that the doubled child tax credit, that's $2,000 instead of $1,000, the higher standard deduction for most taxpayers, the qualified business income tax credit, the 20%, and then a bunch of other stuff too, for that's, with more business and things like that. That will all become permanent. And then also there's some temporary 4-year provisions that the House Ways and Means tax bill. They're the ones, the House Ways and Means Committee is the one who puts together the tax portion of this mega bill that's coming out. There are also some temporary provisions, so where they'll temporarily boost the child tax credit by $500. They'll temporarily increase the standard deduction by $1,000 for single filers and $1,500 for joint married filers. So there's a lot of different tax relief initiatives and things that are put in this bill. Additionally, Trump made promises on the campaign trail that he would end taxes on tips and end taxes on overtime pay. Those are also included, but only for 4 years in this package that passed the House Ways and Means Committee and is now on to the House Budget Committee so that they can assemble the House Ways and Means tax portion and the 10 other portions that all make up the policy agenda bill.
Right. So we've got the no tax on tips, no tax on overtime's big, campaign promises that were very popular. We even saw, former Vice President Kamala Harris try to basically adopt the no tax on tips policy after Trump rolled it out. So I think it's a very popular provision. Seems like it's going to make it in the final bill. But how do we pay for all this? Of course, that's the big question. You see a lot of rhetoric coming from Democrats right now about sort of draconian Medicaid cuts and that these are cruel. And but you see others on the right, like House Speaker Mike Johnson, saying they're just returning this to pre-COVID levels, or only cutting things for people who don't have children, who are able-bodied people who don't have children. Can you give some insight into, is Medicaid being cut, and what kind of cuts are we seeing?
So House Energy and Commerce, they're in charge of Medicaid, among other things. And they found about $500 billion in savings from reforming and restructuring Medicaid. So this is where the accusations of, kicking people off Medicaid rolls and things like that come from. So what the House Energy and Commerce bill, which also passed committee, would do is it would close Medicaid financing loopholes used by states, for one thing. And then it would bring Medicaid eligibility requirements basically down to pre-COVID levels. So what we saw happen in the Biden administration in 2022, I believe, was Biden, not only did he authorize a 20% increase in Medicaid spending, he also extended Medicaid eligibility to the single, without dependents, able-bodied adults, instead of, the elderly, the disabled, low-income children, pregnant women, the people that Medicaid was originally supposed to serve. So that expansion really ballooned the amount of people who are on these Medicaid rolls, and obviously increased a lot of spending. So by bringing back work requirements for the expanded class, again, able-bodied people without children, that will probably remove eligibility for some of these people. And hopefully the Republicans are thinking return the Medicaid rolls to pre-COVID levels. And so that would save, again, like hundreds of billions of dollars. So yeah, that's where a lot of this is coming from, because Republicans are saying we're just reforming Medicaid and we're keeping it around for longer. And they're saying, actually, these spending reductions, the reductions in spending this is going to make, will not actually result in an overall cut to Medicaid in the future. Because again, Biden increased the spending by 20%. So even though it's, like $500 billion or something like that is technically being cut, overall Medicaid spending over the next decade will still increase by at least 3% a year. Some people are saying. So again, like I said, it's more complicated than just saying this is cuts to Medicaid. It's really more reform and structuring, and there will definitely be people who are no longer eligible under this plan if it gets implemented, including people who are in the country illegally. Congressional Budget Office estimates that about 1.4 million people who are in the country legally are receiving Medicaid right now. So that's also something that would change under this bill. So again, it's much more nuanced, I think, than Democrats are saying, but it is true that there are going to be a couple million people at least who are currently eligible due to the Biden era expansion, but will probably no longer be eligible once things change.
Okay. Well, thanks, Therese, for illuminating this very complex situation. We'll be following it closely at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Casey and Therese. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the California case that may require parental notification for lessons on gender, it's our Eliana Trudeau.
Today, we're talking about a case in front of a California judge about gender lessons in elementary school and kindergarten. Joining me to dig into this is California reporter for the Center Square, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, can you give us the background on this case before we get into kind of the latest details?
Hey, Eliana. at Encinitas, the elementary school has a buddy program in which older students are paired with younger students, in this case, fifth graders and kindergartners, and they have a sort of weekly mentorship class program together. The activities they normally participate in are things that I did in my buddy program at school too, which is stuff like gardening, arts, just fun collaborative things. Sometimes they'll read books. They read books to each other, but there are notices that go out each week to parents on what the books are. And these books are chosen by the older students themselves because they want to share them with their buddies. I think it's a sweet idea and a sweet program. Here's where things got a little weird. Teachers chose a book to read, and they also didn't notify parents about what that book was. That's because this book is the gender identity book, My Shadow is Pink, which the court ruling says is about a, quote, boy who likes to wear dresses and play with toys associated with girls. And the entire conflict about this book is, within the book, is that there is a boy who likes being like a girl. His father doesn't accept this, and his father, eventually overcomes his, prejudices to accept that his, the boy's color is pink and not blue. And it's a book about gender theory and gender identity for young children. Before this book was taught, one staff member allegedly said to another, and this is verbatim from the complaint, we might just inspire some sweet things to fly toward their shadow tomorrow, which does seem to suggest that the lesson had a desired outcome. So teachers read the book to the fifth grade students in preparation for the buddy program. And then the fifth graders were joined by their kindergarten buddies, who were sat down next to their assigned mentors. They're paired with the same person, for each of these weekly classes. And the teacher then showed a read-along video of the book. So the father accepts his son's pink shadow not as a phase, but reflecting the boy's innermost self. And then the teachers instructed the kids to participate in what's called an art activity, in which the teachers told the kindergartners to pick a color that represents you. And then have the fifth graders trace their buddies' shadows on the ground with their choice of colored chalk. The fifth grader plaintiffs felt uncomfortable with this assignment. They felt that it contradicted their personal beliefs, and they didn't feel comfortable affirming the book's message to their buddies because they know they're in a position of trust with these younger kids and think that what was being taught to them is wrong. Because these were Christian children who felt that this was contrary to what they knew or thought was right and wrong.
So then, what's the latest in this case? What has the judge ruled so far?
Well, the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and let me provide some more background on the school and their other lessons and opt-out programs. So the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, saying, okay, you need to allow for opt-outs and parental notification for gender identity related lessons in this buddy program, because the judge looked at the school's other programs and found parents always got notification and opt-out options for gender identity lessons in the human growth and development unit. The school had said, it would be too much work, and it would create an undue burden for us to create an opt-out for any related materials and classes. The judge disregarded this argument and said, you clearly offer opt-outs and notification policies for similar topics and different classes, so you should just do it here. The ruling also did find that the buddy program is a mandatory part of the curriculum, and that this lesson had violated the First Amendment for forcing the plaintiffs, the fifth graders, to, quote, mouth support for views they find objectionable. Because, if you're a fifth grade student, are you going to engage in a lengthy debate with your teacher about morality and whether or not something you're instructed to do is right or wrong? Many students wouldn't, some would. But this ruling just affirms parents' rights to be notified of related issues like this. A similar Supreme Court case is probably going to go the way of parents as well. In Maryland, there is a LGBTQ series of books in the English curriculum for young children. That is a mandatory part of the curriculum, and parents are seeking an opt-out for that. This case could actually provide, this is just a preliminary injunction, which means that we're going to see a full, permanent injunction, when the case is heard in full. But this ruling could probably influence, what happens in the Supreme Court and, use a citation or justification, for a more national, ruling.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. I'm sure we'll continue to follow both this case and the case in Maryland as they continue to develop.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to discuss rent control. It's Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. It's always great to be with you. Washington State Governor Bob Ferguson signed into legislation a bill that would put rent control measures in place for the state of Washington. It's joining a relatively small number of states around the country. I believe it's 3 that have like very specific rent control laws. But this is a subject that seems to polarize. The idea of rent control overall, is it a good one? Is it a bad one? And then we'll talk about this particular policy.
Look, it's definitely terrible policy. Okay. It's just a bad one. All right. That's it. And it's not coming from me. So don't accuse me of anything. It's just overwhelming evidence coming from the, academic literature on this topic. And I understand why it is so popular. Of course, there are short-term benefits, right? And the short-term benefits is, of course, it's going to protect the existing tenants by limiting their rent increases, right? Yeah. So like if you already live in the house, it's keeping your rent artificially low, when compared to market rents. And so you're like, well, I'm okay. There's a downside to that though, is that you stay in the unit so much longer than you normally would. The house is likely no longer the right house for you. If a job comes up somewhere else, guess what? You're not moving to go to that job. So it has broad economic implications. If young, healthy, able workers with skills are no longer moving to where the best jobs are for them, right? Then you get a dip in productivity, in economic productivity and economic growth. That's one of the unintended consequences, but there are many unintended consequences. And I could go down the list.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So, I mean, when you look at rent control in Washington State, what you're really looking at would be rent control primarily in the greater Seattle area, King County, Snohomish County. I mean, that's, where I think that there is a, perceived housing shortage.
There is a very real housing deficit.
I was being deferential. Inside of this bill that was passed, just to be clear, I'm taking this directly from Carlene Johnson's story from the Center Square. After some back and forth between the two chambers, and this is discussion in the Washington State Legislature. After some back and forth between the two chambers, lawmakers passed engrossed House Bill 1217, which limits rent increases to 7% plus inflation or 10%, whichever is lower. The rent cap for manufactured and mobile homes is 5%. I'm not sure that there's a tremendous number of mobile homes, in Seattle proper. Landlords could still set rent at whatever they please when a tenancy begins. With rent control coming on and this bill going into effect, I'm not sure what the start date for this would be. Typically, a piece of legislation is is decided, of course, during the legislative session, and then it would go into effect. I'd have to see when this goes into law. So, I mean, can we expect in this moment, rents in Washington state, specifically in the Seattle-King County area, to increase immediately to account for what would be coming in terms of rent control?
I mean, I guess the first thing would be, you'd have to have, unfortunately, landlords would have to basically push out tenants that are there, right? So there's a lot of nuances to this policy. And I'd have to really take the time to analyze all of the levers, because I think they're very familiar with the literature. And so they try to put in a bunch of levers to minimize the impact. So I can't speak specifically to this one policy, because I would have to take a little bit of time to analyze all of the little levers that they put in there. But I can tell you just in general that very often when you limit rent increases, what tends to happen is you get less investment, not only in the number of units that are built or that become rental units, but also in the quality of those units. We've seen that throughout everywhere that's been tried. The second thing is, because the quality of the units decreases due to less investment, private investments flowing to those rent-controlled areas, property tax revenues, the value of those units also is much lower, and property tax revenues also dip because those units are not as valuable to the marketplace as other units, as other similar units that are not in a rent-controlled area. So it also hurts local governments, trying to raise enough property tax revenues to go ahead and invest in the community. I also mentioned reduced mobility, right? Worker mobility. And so in the long run, what you end up with is a local economy that is worse off for all the reasons I highlighted. And so that is the cost. And also ultimately, who bears the cost? It's ultimately lower income families. It's lower income families, that basically will have fewer available units in worse conditions, that will face higher rent increases over the long run because, right, that are no longer moving in search of opportunity because they're stuck in a unit because they won't be able to afford anything else. And they're right. And so that's the problem with this idea in general. Right. And again, I'm not speaking about this particular policy because I haven't analyzed it, but I'm telling you that just in general, rent control has been tried and it has failed every single time. It is a popular thing, but it's not necessarily good policy.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.